Hello. Hello. Thanks so much to Play by Play and New Zealand Games Festival for having me here. I'm really honored to be talking to you guys. And a really big thanks to Claire and Robert for being such accommodating organizers and bringing me over here. It's been great. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time telling you about my background, give you some context for the things I want to talk about today. So it's going to be a little self-indulgent for a few. So here's my timeline. I was born in South Africa in 1982. My family moved to Chicago in 1985, where I grew up. I bought my first issue of Electronic Gaming Monthly when I was 10 years old. It's the Street Fighter II issue. And the last time I was in New Zealand was actually after my bar mitzvah. I had my bar mitzvah in Melbourne because I have family there, and then came and traveled to South Island here for a week with my dad and my brother. So it's been a while since I've been here, so thanks for having me back. And PlayStation was my first home console in 1996. My parents wouldn't let me have like a TV system before that, so I had to go to friends' houses and play Super Nintendo and things. Then I did a bunch of stuff that doesn't matter as much, dropped out of film school, who knows. Then I started working at EB Games for a few years, and I started up a gaming blog with a friend. Just started writing about games, and quit that job and moved to San Francisco, basically bought a one-way plane ticket in 2007. Figured I had to move to California to get a job writing about games full-time, because that's where all the magazines were at the time. So I got a job at the same magazine I'd grown up reading, which was really exciting, at EGM and their sister website, oneup.com. Worked there for a few years. We had a lot of like video shows and podcasts, but this was sort of before everyone else was doing it, and the parent company didn't know what to do with any of us or how to make money off of it, so they just laid us all off instead. And I wound up working at PlayStation. I'd actually interviewed for a job there a few years before, and that job happened to be available when I reached out afterward. So I ended up being there for 7 years, doing indie business development, finding and signing cool indie games. So that was sort of a big chunk of my career. I went to Oculus for about 14 months afterwards, just to get a dive deeper into VR, but then needed a bigger change in my life. So I left, and now I'm indie myself. And these are a bunch of the games that I signed at PlayStation and spent really a lot of my time working on, probably hundreds of hours spent on each of these games, just from my side. I'm really proud of the work that I did there to help shape the culture of independent games on PlayStation, especially leading up to and through the PS4 launch. And everything I'm going to talk about today is filtered through this background, so take it with a grain of salt. I don't think I'm an expert, but at least you know I have decent taste, if nothing else. So going indie myself was a big decision, and you can see the difference that it made to my income. Last year I made less than a third as much money as the year before, basically, but I'm a lot happier, and I have a healthier relationship to work, which is good. This talk isn't about quitting your job. Maybe it should have been, but since being independent, I was very lucky. The first thing I worked on was Celeste. I was an editor and did a little bit of writing for the story and the script. I did some editing and a lot more writing on Guacamelee 2. I'm an advisor on Untitled Goose Game. And I have a game design podcast sort of through the lens of Splunky, which I think is why Robert really wanted to bring me here. And Robert will be on this week's episode, so thanks for the bribe. And I spent some time traveling last year giving a talk in a few different places about why it's so important to find champions to fight for your games and how to find them. I gave it at GCAP and at the Busan Indie Festival in Korea, and I gave sort of an upgraded version of it at GDC last month, which you can watch for free online. I think it's a really important topic, so if you want to see sort of the granular, like why it's important and how to find these people, you can check it out free online. So this is actually a slide from that talk where I discuss what sorts of games have the easiest time finding champions to fight for them. And I think they usually fall into one of two categories. So there's sort of something that's like fundamentally new. A few games that are an example of that, I think, in the past decade or so. Just doing something a little different, or something that's the best of a genre. So things that are, maybe not the newest, most unique idea, but just done really well. And I think the chances are you're probably not going to make something that's the best of a genre, right? I'm sorry. Well, the Hollow Knight team isn't far from here, so maybe I'm wrong. I don't know if there's any of them here. But it's really hard. It takes a long time, and if you're looking for funding, it's also a really difficult pitch, like I'm going to be the team to make the best version of such and such. And if it's anything but the best, it could get skipped over and sort of blend into everything else. So if you look at, these are just a bunch of like Metroidvania-ish games that came out all last year. These are all great games, so much love and character put into them. And a lot of them have sold decently well, but most of them were in development for a really long time. And at the end of the year, I think Hollow Knight and maybe Dead Cells were really the only ones that we were still sort of talking about. And this isn't even counting all the other smaller ones that are like just below the surface of visibility like this. All of these games are sort of competing to be the same thing, which is a fun action combat game for gamers with a lot of dexterity. I mean, I love a lot of these games, but it's a tough space. And it's difficult on the AAA side of things, too. If you look at something like Anthem, it's trying to be a lot of different things, like a Destiny-style loot rating game, a BioWare-style narrative-driven sci-fi experience, and a shooter. And none of those things were, really unique. And because it wasn't sort of the very best in class at them, from what I understand, it seems like the world moved on without it a bit. But the good news for us here, if you're here, you're probably not working at a big corporation that needs to chase a specific audience or make decisions based on shareholders. You can probably make whatever you want within reason. And I'm being a little presumptuous, but I'm guessing that the biggest challenges are financial, right? Being able to fund your game and then making sure it sells well enough to be able to continue making games. And I think these are ultimately pretty good challenges to have. So again, let's say for a minute you're not going to try to make something that's the very best of its genre. Which means you can consider making something genuinely new, or something personal, or something weird. You have that freedom, and in a commercialized creative medium, I don't think we should take that for granted. You have the choice to think about your games as art or product or something else completely. You need to make things sustainably, but you probably don't need to answer to someone else while you're making them. And I think that's ultimately been the greatest unsung win of the democratization of game-making tools, is that it's not only trained programmers who can make things now, it's a much wider swath of people with different levels of access to technology and different skills. And this has resulted in, and will continue to result in, more and more varied experiences being created. And we're also seeing the beginnings of change in how games are distributed online, some really healthy competition. And the barrier to entry on consoles really has completely changed over the course of one generation. It's much easier than it ever was. And there's new challenges that come with all these things, of course. But in theory, it means that more and more people have the opportunity to be exposed to your games. But you might ask, of course, isn't making new personal or weird things risky? And when you're trying to build something sustainably and build a sustainable situation, don't you want to avoid risk? Well, I really strongly believe that making these risky things can be good for business in a very real way. And I'll explain why I think that and give you some examples from throughout my career. This is the GDC talk that I mentioned earlier that I gave. There's a lot going on. But like I said, the takeaway was how important it is to find champions to fight for your games. And the idea there being that basically anything that gets done to help or promote your game is because someone somewhere cares about it, right? An individual person with their own tastes and interests. And for a long time, I was that champion for a lot of games when I worked at the big platforms. And that's how really a lot of the business of games gets done. It's just people like me who like a thing and want to support that thing and share it with more people. And it's so important to releasing a game sustainably, but it's something that's never really talked about. And God, this drives me nuts. I can't. Yeah, when I see someone's laptop and I see this, I'm like, or a phone, I'm like, no, hide the badge. But anyone in a position of looking at pitches probably gets a lot of pitches, and anyone who's deciding which games to promote on a storefront gets, they have a lot of things to choose from. And on top of that, people reaching out to me about their games, I would go to a dozen trade shows every year, and I'd walk the floor looking for cool games, looking for things that I hadn't seen before, things that were eye-catching, games that clearly were something that a developer just had a vision for, that they were making for themselves and not making to appeal to me. And when you see enough games, a lot of it starts to blur together and become sort of a known quantity. And then the riskier, more unique things really stand out, and those became the things that I wanted to fight for. Games like Nog. Nog's this game about these floating heads that are also puzzle boxes that you rotate around and poke at them to solve puzzles. I guess that one kind of looks like me. And I always thought the game looked really beautiful and playful and different from everything else. And it spent sort of a while finding itself and getting the controls just right. But I stayed in touch with the dev team over a few years while they pitched it to us in a couple different forms when I was at PlayStation. And eventually we ended up signing the game to PlayStation's Pub Fund program to help them with some funding. Double Fine ended up picking it up to publish. And its developer co-op was just focused on making something cool and unique, and different opportunities came along. So they ended up bringing the game to VR, and we were able to promote it heavily as one of the earlier PSVR titles. And they also retooled it to work on mobile, to have another launch as an early AR game on iOS. And Salim Dabous, who runs their studio, he told me, he said, I definitely consider Nog a success. While small on the financial side of things, it brought us legitimacy, opportunities, contracts, created lots of chances for the studio that now they're making the most of. And they really got a lot of mileage out of making a weird game, and it had a big impact on their sustainability as a studio. Another one is Octodad, which probably a lot of you have seen before. And I think one of the reasons that you're likely to have seen it is because we really made it a big part of the PS4 launch story. We brought the game to 26 different events. We had it on stage at E3. We built them a big Octodad costume that someone walked around in. We gave them like a private suite to show press on the PS4 launch event, and a lot more. And it wasn't because Octodad was a great game necessarily. This is like from the team themselves. I've had some fun with it. But it was a unique game and something that felt new to me. It made me want to fight for it. And it went on to sell like 2 million copies over 5 years. And that was a little out of date even, which is incredible. And another one is Sports Friends. This is a collection of very different competitive local multiplayer games. I hope you've played it before. And the game's done really well over time. It's made grossed over $1 million. And one of the developers, my friend Doug Wilson, who actually drove down here this week from Auckland with, he saw the PlayStation Move peripheral, and he made Johann Sebastian Joust one of the included games. And it was such an exciting use of it, and it really stood out from the other shooters and action games that people were making with the Move at the time. And again, I probably spent hundreds of hours working on the Sony side of things to make Sports Friends happen on PlayStation. And it was all because I wanted to bring this like unique, weird use of Move to PlayStation. It's like, don't look at your TV, like have this weird social experience and push your couch out the way. And I guess that predated VR a bit. And also this was before I was friends with Doug, for the record. Signed his game, and then we became friends. And I also realized that Nog and Octodad and Sports Friends, they're not truly weird games in the experimental sense. But I think they still stand out a lot in the console space, especially when we were promoting them right alongside other AAA games. And as a side note, I just want to share with you, when I think of weird games, I think of the PS1 import LSD Dream Simulator. I don't know if anyone's seen this or played it. Any hands? Yeah, okay, cool. This is, a friend showed this to me in 2004. It's weird and pretty terrifying. You just sort of wander around these weird places and experience weird things, and then like you just get teleported somewhere else and keep experiencing weird things. I just want to put it on your radar if you've never seen it. I think actually it's like a PS1 classic you can get on PS4 if you make like a Japanese account. Anyways, it's worth tracking down. And I also want to tell you about a game called One Way Trip that came out on PS4 and Vita. In the game, the story of the game is that the world has been like dosed with poison, and everyone has 6 hours to live, and they're hallucinating as they're getting closer to death. And the game was designed by this guy, Michael Fraunhofer, who's like the sweetest guy you'll ever meet, and programmed by his even sweeter mother, Christine. And the game is this really mature, like foul-mouthed thing. It's really bizarre. And I don't know if it was successful by the time it launched. I was gone from PlayStation from then. But their game and their story and the team is really unique, and I really wanted to help get them on the platform. And regardless of the outcome, I think it's really cool that they were able to launch something like this on PS4. A couple of years ago, that wouldn't have been possible. And I don't even know if the people at PlayStation currently like know how messed up this game is. Maybe their QA department does because they played it, but. Anyways, those are some examples of sort of the new and maybe some of the weird. But what about more personal games? There aren't a lot of popular games that think about the human condition somehow. I think more personal games are finally breaking through to a more mainstream conversation now, thankfully. And Florence and Dream Daddy are games about relationships, right, and communicating with other people, and both seem to have seen a lot of success. And we've seen examples of this in the past few years where genres are being subverted into vehicles for more personal, empathetic storytelling. Night in the Woods and Oxenfree feel distinctly like small-town America games to me. But you have an entirely different culture to draw from here, right? I'd love to hear your stories. And when I submitted a draft of this talk, Robert actually agreed with me and just gave me this quote, which I then asked if I could use in this. He said, "We get so many games about the American experience that I'm more familiar with parts of the US than I am with parts of my own country. We see New Zealand stories told in film from time to time, but most of our games are set in generic America land." And I haven't had a chance to play Guardian yet. I'm looking forward to it as an interesting example of this. But yeah, I would love to hear your stories. And I think that more personal storytelling is actually a big part of why the most recent God of War game went over so well with everyone. It's still a little heavy-handed at times, but ultimately it's a game about a relationship between a father and a son, whereas the previous games in the series weren't really like about anything, I would say. And I know some of this is obvious, but I think it bears repeating when we see it winning Game of the Year at the BAFTAs and such, because I'm pretty confident that it wouldn't have gone over quite as well as it did if it didn't have that focus. And there's been a lot of recent discussion around accessibility and conflating it with game difficulty, which I don't really want to wade into, but I would like to talk briefly about conceptual accessibility. To me, this is making games with more mundane themes, a narrower focus, and generally making things that don't primarily appeal to gamers, right? To me, this can mean games that people can put themselves into more easily, games that are welcoming, not just the power fantasies that sometimes dominate our industry. And I've often experienced this while playing board games. So I think most of us here are probably, fantasy settings. I guess we got the card game going. And maybe you've played Talisman, but it's easy to forget that not everyone likes fantasy, right? And even though something like Agricola is more mechanically complex, the sort of pastoral farming theme seems like an easier entry point with people who don't play games regularly. At least I've had this experience. I've also become a huge fan of this Japanese game called Wind the Film that's about street photography in the 1960s. And I find that everyone I show it to gets really excited about the theme, and the gameplay complements it well. And I think even though these games are sort of escalating in complexity, I think the themes really escalate in accessibility, and that makes a big difference when I'm trying to get the game to the table and get people excited about it. And in video games, this might include games about cooking or farming or being a doctor, or a game about being a jerk goose. And I think this is something that can feel counterintuitive in business, right? Pitching game platforms and publishers on funding or promoting something that isn't targeted at their core audience. But really, I think we know, us in this room know who the bigger audience is, and it's not the 100 million gamers. It's a lot broader than that. It's everyone else as well. And this is something that you guys are really good at already, actually. If a little vehicle obsessed. I hope someone can give me like a great explanation of that later, because I just realized, I was like, this is a weird theme. Please someone explain it to me before I leave the country. Maybe this talk should be about like making the mode of transport game that you've all been sitting on and secretly want to make. And then again, birds show up and disrupt everything. Torapon looks amazing as well, my favorite kind of mundane. And when you start to think about some of the bigger entities that are funding games right now, it's not just gaming companies, it's tech companies getting more serious about games, whose primary market is everyone, right, beyond just traditional gamers. So more than ever, I would guess that they're looking for a wide breadth of experience. I mean, look at the sort of attention that Apple, showered on Florence. In a lot of ways, it's the perfect time to be making and pitching your most unique games. And genuinely, more companies are funding games right now at this moment than ever before. So your chances of connecting with someone who may be able to help fund your game are higher than they've ever been. So to take advantage of that. This is my friend Callum Underwood, who I worked with at Oculus. He does scouting for Raw Fury these days, amongst other things. This is a real story. And he's always saying that he doesn't want to sign a 7 out of 10 game, right? A safe game. He'd much rather sign something that could end up being a 1 out of 10 or a 10 out of 10. In my experience, most people in business development positions, they sign the most promising games to give them the best chance at success. But what the games end up being and how they're received, that sort of doesn't matter. Games need to stand on their own once they're released. Meaning that people usually, aren't signing games that will be a guaranteed success. They're signing things that they think other people will be excited about by the time they come out. And this is what anyone who's spending money funding games is doing. They're just planting seeds, hoping that they blossom into something cool in the future. And there has to be a chance it will grow into something special and unique. Otherwise, it's not worth doing, maybe. But as Callum reminded me, he said the future will always have a place for weird games, which I totally agree with. And, of course, making a great game and getting it funded may not be enough to succeed commercially. Marketing, talking to press, posting cool GIFs online, these are all important too and should be considered a part of making your game. And even if you don't want to be transparent about your development in that way and that's not a fit for your game, I think having some sort of plan is really important, and having that plan from the start. There's a lot of approaches to telling people about that your game exists, but you probably should have one in mind along the way. If you only start telling people about your game when it's nearly finished, you're making things way more difficult for yourself and usually impossible to overcome by that point. So I like this quote a lot from my friend Aaron Sanfilippo of Flip-Fly, who made Race the Sun. He said, "I've learned that the best predictor of success for people making games is whether they can take feedback constructively and turn it into positive change for their work. There are few things that are more valuable than honest, candid feedback. Learn to crave it." And I think whether it is about your marketing plan or the game itself, it's important that you're able to take feedback this way. I think it can sometimes be hard to get honest, actionable feedback when you're part of like a cozy, really supportive community like this, like all you guys. But I think it's important to be able to ask for it and to be able to internalize it in a healthy, productive way. And being able to take feedback, being humble, and being easygoing about your work will make people want to work with you, and I think it'll make your work better as well. And don't forget, the game you're making is just an extension of you. So don't undervalue your story and the circumstances around making the game that you're making and why you're making it. It's a pretty scary time right now around the world, I think, politically, environmentally, and there's often a rhetoric from people that we don't want to hear opinions from our artists, right? We just want to experience their art. So let your opinion be your art. Don't be afraid to put more of you in your games. And I've mentioned funding and sustainability a lot, but I think it's also worth taking a second to sort of calibrate what we think of as success. And sometimes it's easy to feel pressure or unrealistic expectations when we see or hear stories about indie games blowing up and turning creators into millionaires overnight. Maybe your goal isn't to make games long term. Maybe you just have that one game you've always been dying to make and you don't care how well it sells in a sense. You just want it to exist. Or maybe you don't see yourself being represented in the games that you play and you want to help change that. Or maybe you want to say something about climate control or climate change or gun control, and it's the medium you best know how to communicate ideas in. So during GDC, Bennett Foddy and Zach Gage did a talk called Put Your Name on Your Game, and Bennett showed this slide during the talk where he looked across all games listed on Moby Games and found that the vast majority of studios only release one game, and that's part of their argument of why you should put your name on it. And there's sort of a nihilist take here that I have to insert myself, which is that the chances are the game you're working on right now will very likely be the only one your studio releases, just if you look at the odds. And the odds are sort of against you that that's going to sell well. So why the fuck not make sure that it's exactly the thing you want to make and it says exactly what you want to say? And despite trying to make this a largely positive talk, I feel like I should acknowledge the indie-pocalypse rhetoric, which is a real thing in so much as more games are releasing than ever before, and it's harder to stand out from that crowd and get attention and press coverage. But the reality is that unless you were making Xbox Live Arcade games in 2008, there's never really been a guarantee of success. The odds have always been against you. And being an indie dev is tough, right? It's a huge risk. I think overall, though, we're in a really good place, especially when you look at something like independent music or film. I think those industries have been around a lot longer, and it's actually even harder to be an independent musician or filmmaker. It's a really disruptive time in our industry, but more people are making games, more people are funding games, and more people are buying games than ever, and I think that's something to be excited about. Which sort of leads me to this year's theme, the power of many for the conference. And I read this as something sort of like it takes a village, which traditionally is used in the context of it takes a village to raise a child. But to me, it means a few different things in the context of making video games. I think everyone needs to find their own path to success and define what success means to them, like we just talked about. But you can't do it without each other, or at least you probably shouldn't. You guys have a superpower here, and that's your community, or the potential for one if you don't feel like you're part of it already. And this is something that not everyone has the luxury of, and I don't think remote work is quite the same, even though that's mostly what I do. Find other creators to spend physical time with in person, show each other your games, talk about what's keeping you up at night. And I think being able to be a mentor is another superpower that you have. To me, a big part of being a mentor is about proactively sharing knowledge and experience, not just when people ask you for it. A lot of the best local indie scenes that I've seen around the US have this phenomenon where many of the most successful devs, after they've had success, sort of withdraw from the community. And maybe it means that they don't need their community as much anymore, even though I don't think that's really true. But actually it means that the community needs them more than ever. So stay engaged, help others find that success that you've seen, and it'll just lift everyone up. And another one is diversity, right? When I joined Oculus, I went through the Facebook orientation where they talked about the issue of diversity, which I knew was a hot topic in Silicon Valley. And being a white male, I was really ignorant to a lot of the actual goals and function of diversity beyond just the rhetoric around it. And they talked about how making a product that's targeted at the entire world requires people from all sorts of backgrounds working on it. It's sort of the only way to do something like that, which feels like super obvious when you think about it that way, but I honestly hadn't been. So when you think about making games for a wide spectrum of people, you need a wide spectrum of people to make them. Another power we have is variety, right? I recently heard someone discuss the why of AAA games and how there usually isn't a why beyond financial motivations, if I'm being cynical. And there's always a why with indie games, and that's because we can afford to take risks, and as I talked about, risks can be good for business. And it's really important on like a broad arts culture level to be making the varied sorts of games that we make. And our parents' generation are gonna be the last one where games aren't really a ubiquitous part of their lives. So with all of us becoming the older generation eventually, what are those games gonna mean to us, right? What are games gonna represent in our lives? And so I was blown away by the drive down here from Auckland. I know South Island is nicer. I'll go back again one day. I thought it was beautiful, and you have incredible inspiration in the natural world here around your country, and it's important to have a well-rounded life of travel and art and other culture. And Splunky creator Derek Yu wrote a book about the creation of his game, which I reread recently, and I love this section in it from sort of about inspiration, which I'm going to read for you. It's a little bit long, but he says, "The creative mind is like a big pile of jigsaw puzzle pieces. Some pieces were made by other people, inspirational words of advice, an intriguing screenshot from a game you've never heard of, a haunting melody, and some are gained through life experiences. Some pieces are already connected, either because they came that way or because you were walking down the street or taking a shower and they somehow found each other. Sometimes a single piece is missing, and once that piece is uncovered, two other pieces from different ends of the pile can finally be connected. It's important to accumulate many, many jigsaw pieces, since the more you have available, the more things you can build. But eventually you have to sit down and start sifting through the pieces to put them all together. This is the work part of creation, and it can often feel frustrating, like when two pieces seem like they should fit, but they don't. Sometimes you know that there's a perfect piece around, but you're not sure where it is. Is it even in your head? But like any challenging task with a noble purpose, the frustration always gives way to joy, elation, and ultimately satisfaction when you finished a big part of a new puzzle." So I'm here primarily to give this keynote, but I'm also here to connect with you guys as people, as I'm sure we all are. And I think it's important that we see each other as people first, even before we see each other as potential collaborators. And everyone has their own tastes and idiosyncrasies, and finding where you intersect with people is important, from programmers to platform people to everyone else. So I wanted to share with you a little bit of the art and media that I've been thinking about recently, if you'll indulge me for a couple minutes longer. A couple films, actually, that I think about a lot. Coherence, I don't know, has anyone seen Coherence in here? No? Okay, okay, awesome. So Coherence is this low-budget, minimalist sci-fi film, a little bit like Primer, where it does a lot with no budget. And it's mostly unknown actors. It's only 88 minutes long. Highly recommended to you guys. It's really creative with its world, really clever with the storytelling. I saw it 5 years ago, and I still think about it all the time. I talk about it all the time. Swiss Army Man, anyone else? A little more maybe? Yeah, cool, great. Oh, nice, okay, about a quarter of you. So this is the Farting Corpse movie, right? By the directors of the Turn Down for What music video. I recently rewatched it, and this has become like a top 10 movie for me. It's sort of hard to say what it's about, but maybe like the delicacy of the human condition. It's really stirring and beautiful and funny and sad. I think it's a masterpiece, so those two things have had a lot of impact on me. This is sort of a minimalist board game by Itten Games. It's just really, really beautiful components, just feels nice to play. Simple rules, but deeper than it seems at first. A really bizarre theme. You're like trying to keep this fire going and cook meat to feed the dogs, but then if the fire goes out, the dogs turn on you and attack you, and you have to have enough meat to feed them back. I played it a lot last year and enjoyed it with a wide range of people. It's just really beautiful. And it's fun just like stacking the dogs and playing with things while you're playing it. This is Space Park by Keymaster Games. This is sort of a classic sci-fi theme with fantastic art and components, sort of an engine building game. It's really accessible. You can teach it in like 3 minutes. Probably my favorite game of last year. And as far as video games, I love all of Philip Stollenmeyer's work, especially Zip Zap and Super Type. I hope you guys have played these or some of his other games. Both of them are free on iOS, so these physics puzzle games with just so much humor and cleverness expressed through the level design. And they get super difficult, but they become even funnier as the challenges increase. And they're just great style, really great sound design, really wonderful. And another one I'm playing recently, if you haven't played it yet, Ape Out, I think is fantastic. It's a really satisfying action game, but with a lot of really creative and subversive level design. A lot more to it than there seems at first, I think, and it just has great style. So I'd love to hear what things have had a big influence in your life and your work, if you're willing to share them with me, throughout the show maybe, and share them with each other. In the age of social media, being so negative and cynical, and so many of our interactions being about commiserating with each other about what's going on in the world, I think the least we can do is share things that we love with each other. So, sharing things you love is sharing yourself. Sharing yourself can sometimes feel uncomfortable or risky, but please remember, risky really genuinely can be good, both in life and in business. And there's never been a better time to be making the games you really want to make. So you can start this week. Thanks, and have a great play-by-play. And maybe there's time for Q&A or something else. So yeah, if anyone wants to chat about anything. Or I'll be around for the rest of the show if you want to talk about something else, not in front of a crowd. Mics on the sides. All right, great. My talk was complete. Oh, there we go. Yeah, I'll repeat it. Diplomatically giving negative feedback. Yeah, I think people, in my experience, I talked about how important it is to be able to sort of take negative or hopefully constructive feedback as well. I think people are really looking for honest feedback, maybe more than you think they are even. I think part of the, I don't do a ton of the consulting stuff, but that's like a bit of what I do these days. And I find that actually when people are paying me to give feedback on their stuff, like they, the more honest the feedback, the better. It's sort of sometimes the only way to get that sort of feedback is to like pay someone to give it to you. Because outside of that context, when you're just sort of showing friends or whatever, I think people tend to hold back a little bit. I think it's all about just being comprehensive, really, of like, okay, I have this negative reaction to something, and it's not helpful when you're just like, okay, I don't love this, right? It's like, well, why don't I love this? Let me actually get to the heart of the issue, like what is rubbing me wrong about it? Is it just the aesthetic and it's something that's not gonna change and that's part and parcel with the game, or it's just not for me? And I think that something else is speaking personally, like this isn't working for me, really, this part of the game. Not that this just isn't working, period, because you don't really know. And I think part of, when you're showing a prototype or a game to someone and you want feedback, I think hopefully the prototype you're showing has sort of the heart of what the experience is that you're going for. So I think also prompting people with the right questions is important of what sort of feedback you're looking for, because some things are probably immovable or can't change. And I think similarly, when you're giving feedback, it's worth asking, okay, what sort of feedback are you looking for? Maybe it is just general and I don't want to hear anything, but I think just having that more of a focused dialogue of what they're looking for, and then giving that in the context of, okay, here's what I think about this thing. This feels off to me for some reason, and maybe trying to get at why. And I think just having it be a dialogue instead of like, let me just rant about here's all my problems and what do you have to say about it. I'd probably have something more eloquent if I thought about it more, but yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
Hello, hello.
Hello.
Okay. So you mentioned that you had done some work on Celeste. I was wondering when in the process you were brought on there, and whether you think you were brought on early enough, and what that would mean. Like, how much of an influence did you have, and how much of an influence do you think that was the right amount, I suppose? Sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I came on relatively late. It's a game that took a few years in development, and I came on for like the last 4 or 5 months, really. Matt Thorson, the developer, had written most of the script, but it was his first time like writing a game and writing a story, and he felt a little insecure about it, I think, and wanted some help. And I just left my job, and I was like, hey, what about me as your editor? And he was like, oh, what about you? Actually, we get along already. I've worked with you in a business context, but there's enough sort of trust and we get along with each other. So so he brought me on, and so I think I just sort of helped like nip and tuck the story and help make sure it was the best version of itself. And I think I'm pretty good at helping things read very conversationally and easily. And then I ended up doing a little bit of writing as well, and ended up, I would suggest a few things, and he'd be like, cool, yeah, keep going. And then I got more encouraged and suggested more, and he probably took 90% of my suggestions. But I think the earlier you can do that, the better, certainly. I mean, now, each project I've done, I've come on earlier and written more, and so now I'm working on like 3 different games and doing narrative design for 2 of them, and come in a lot earlier, closer to the start, and your writer can just have a bigger impact from the start, and from world building to just plotting things out and making sure that the gameplay is just fits with the story as best as it can. And I think it's something where, like, one of the projects I'm working on now, I'm starting in about a month, and I'm going to come in and do, not quite full-time, but close to full-time for like 2 months and sort of plot everything out. And then I'm going to come back in later, like 9 months from now, to actually sit down and write all the dialogue, and probably a little bit in between, but not as much. So it is possible you can bring in a writer for some period of time up front just to help plot things out. And a lot of the things I'm doing where I'm this weird combo of like writer and biz dev, it's things that I think most indies sort of just do themselves on their games, but can be that much better if you get some help with it. So I would encourage people to even just have a chat about what you're thinking with a writer, even if you're not ready to hire someone yet. But I think doing it the earlier, the better can be helpful. But even towards the end, even if you don't have a writer and you're writing everything yourself, even bringing someone in just as an editor for the final month or 2 can make a big difference in just the quality of the final product, in my experience. So.